There is a certain culture or trend or whatever you want to call it that's created that may lead some people to believe like, oh, that's how you lead worship. So I need to morph myself into the way that these people lead worship because they're on a big stage. So that must mean success.
Hey, I'm Andrea Olson. I've been leading worship and training worship leaders for nearly 20 years, and my mission is to support worship leaders just like you in volunteer-supported ministries because I know what it's like. I've been there. It's amazing, but you have a big job, and sometimes you might feel a little bit alone. But I'm here to remind you that you aren't. We'll cover spiritual and leadership growth, practical resources, and get encouragement from other worship leaders from all over the world. I truly want to see you lead from the overflow, not the overwhelm. So grab a cup of tea or coffee and join me. Welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast.
Well, I am so happy to be here with you today, largely because I was out all last week with some version of the flu that was not fun at all. It hit my whole family. And so I'm just really grateful to be upright and to be feeling good and to be here with you all today. So, one of the things that I love about the Overflow Worship Podcast is that I get to not only interview people from all over the world. I was just thinking about this actually. It's just fascinating to me that I've been able to talk to people who are in Germany, who are in Ireland, who are in Atlanta, and everywhere in between. And I love that because it's just a beautiful picture of what God is doing in the church all over the place. So I get to talk to people from all over the place, but then also I get to share with you guys what's on my heart and just the things that God is doing in my life. But then also I get to share from my experiences and what I've learned and, share tools and tips and tricks and that kind of thing. And so I just want to say thank you for being a part of this journey with me. I do not take it for granted. I do not take it lightly. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for being on this journey with me. Now, one of the things that I actually say at the end of every podcast, and I'm just going to throw this plug in here at the very beginning because it's really important, is that, hey, if you love the Overflow Worship Podcast, would you please hop onto Apple Podcasts and leave us a review? It really does help. I actually look at all of them. I read them all, and I get excited about them all because it helps me to deliver valuable content to you. When you say like, hey, this content was awesome, or this topic I really appreciated, because that helps me know that it's meeting you where you're at. And that's what I want to do. So if you would take 1 to 2 minutes and head over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review, I would really appreciate it. It helps us reach more people. Now, as a token of my gratitude for you writing a review and for just being on this journey with me, I wanted to invite you to join our free newsletter. So all you got to do is head to overflowworship.com/join, and we give away free stuff every month. In the past, we've done a team devotional. We've done a set list checklist. We've done all sorts of cool stuff. Last month, we did a rehearsal download, like just kind of my techniques and tips for rehearsals. So if you're like, I like free stuff, we would love to have you on our email list. So just head to overflowworship.com/join and you can get on our list and get a bunch of free stuff that hopefully helps you in the ministry that God has called you to. So we cover a wide range of topics, and today we're going to go a little bit more specific. In the past few weeks, it's been some more devotional content. We've had some interviews, we did rehearsals, but today I want to talk specifically about stage presence. And you may be thinking like, okay, I got this locked up, or I don't know that really applies here, right? Well, I would beg to differ and say that it actually does. And so we're going to answer questions like, how much happy is too happy? And what do I need to do on stage when X happens? Or should there be dancing on stage? Should we have this many people on stage? All of those kinds of things. Let's talk about it. So that's what we're going to cover today in the Overflow Worship Podcast. So buckle up. Here we go. Now, one of the things that I get asked often is in regards to stage fright. right? So let's talk about that first, because stage fright is something that affects your stage presence. And this is something, hey, worship leaders, you got to talk to your team about this. You need to tell them, hey, this is an important aspect of what we do because it impacts the people that we serve. And so first of all, let's talk about those people who are like, I'm kind of a little bit nervous to be on stage, and I actually am not very expressive. I don't love to smile on stage or whatever the case may be. Okay, well, let's talk about, first of all, the question of what are you afraid of, right? Well, maybe afraid of messing up, maybe afraid of appearing stupid, or maybe getting made fun of. I don't know. But sometimes for me, it helps me to name that why behind it. Like, what am I so afraid of? And when it comes to stage fright, a lot of times it is just that fear of what could happen. What might happen to me? What if I can't control my hands trembling or the sweat pouring off of my forehead, right? Well, we need to actually set all of that aside, because I have a filter or just a concept that I think really helps people to push through that stage fright and really get to the other side and be able to be fully themselves on stage and fully engaging with people and engaging with the worship. And that is to remember that you are a host. And if you've been with me on the Overflow Worship podcast for a while, you've heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again because it's so incredibly important, that you are a host every single Sunday. And so you don't have to worry about, what are people going to think if I mess up? Or what if I say the wrong thing? What if I sing the wrong word? All of those things happen. And I hate to break it to you, but they're going to happen to you. If you are on stage every single Sunday, week in, week out, it's going to happen to you. Just like I tell my kids all the time, you're going to mess up. You're going to make mistakes. That is okay. It's part of life. And that's actually how we learn and grow the most, is through those mistakes, right? So you got to get past the fact of the what if, because it's probably going to happen, right? And what we need to do is we need to remember we are a host. What does that mean? Every Sunday when people walk in the door, you are hosting them. Just like you wouldn't say someone shows up at your house and they knock on the door and you open the door, you wouldn't be like, hey, and then just walk away, right? You would welcome them in, show them your home, give them a tour, make them feel comfortable, all of these things, right? You've heard me say this before. But it's worth stating again, because once we get over this hurdle, once we get past the fact that we're so scared of messing up or doing something wrong or saying something stupid, then all of a sudden we get to the point where we realize, wait a minute, I get to host these people. Well, I can do that. I can have someone over for dinner, right? I can meet somebody for coffee and make them feel welcome and like a loved human being, right? That's what you're doing on Sundays. And all of a sudden, when we put ourselves in that frame of mind, it helps us to get over those hurdles of fear, because we're not worried about tripping and falling, which, guess what? I've actually done that, physically fallen on my face. So probably whatever you're afraid of, I've done. And look, I didn't die. I'm still here. So it's okay. And we learn and we grow and sometimes get humbled, and it's all right. But you need to shift your focus. That's what I have found is the most helpful, is to shift my focus off of those things and put it on the fact that I get to host people. I get to make them feel welcome, and I get to say, hey, come with me to this place that I love to go, and I want to show you the way, right? And so that is number one. Number one for when you're talking with your team, or if you yourself are just dealing with a little bit of stage fright, or a little bit of a lack of confidence, then this is the first hurdle. So number one, remember that you are a host, okay? Then number two, here's number two. Remember that you don't have to conform yourself into someone that you're not. So number two is be yourself, be you. I remember working with a student years ago, and we were talking about this very thing. This person was very reserved. They were shy, kind of held back. And, I talked to her about the importance of engaging in worship, right? Engaging with the people, because you're hosting them and you want them to see that you love to go to this place, right? And see that you are excited to be there that Sunday. Because sometimes I think people wonder, like, do you even want to be up there? Because they look so sad or miserable. And so I was talking to her about that. But I said, this is so important. I want you to remember this. I am not asking you to be somebody that you're not. And so if you are not somebody who jumps up and down or runs across the stage or whatever, like, that's okay. It is okay. And within the current culture of worship, and with all of the big churches that we see on Instagram or wherever you may see them, I think that there is a certain culture or trend or whatever you want to call it that's created that may lead some people to believe like, oh, that's how you lead worship. So I need to morph myself into the way that these people lead worship because they're on a big stage. So that must mean success, right? And I use that word loosely, but I think you know what I mean. So it's important for us to remember that we don't need to become someone we're not when leading worship. So I challenge you to ask yourself that question, like, who am I trying to be? Maybe that is the foundation of some of the stage fright or just some of the lack of confidence. And maybe it's not stage fright. That's not always the right word to use. So you fill in the blank for what fits for you. But any lack of confidence or apprehension that you feel fully expressing yourself in worship on stage, maybe it's because you feel like you need to be something that you're not. And if you're not naturally someone who is just very expressive and gets excited and likes to jump up and down, that's okay. That is really okay. Now, I would argue that there is a certain level of surrender to the Lord that brings about certain responses, right? It can be tears, it can be joy, it can be, laughter, it can be, whatever that looks like for you when you're in worship. But I would never sit here and tell you that there is a right way or a way that you need to conform into, like, okay, now we're gonna jump up and down here, and then we're gonna run back and forth here, and then we're going to stop and kneel, and then we're gonna do it all over again. No, that's not at all how it works. It is an overflow of the joy that is in our heart, the gratitude that is in our hearts as we just, it's an outward expression, right, of that overflow. And so I encourage you to ask yourself that question. Maybe you're trying to be something that you're not, and that's an honest thing that we have to ask ourselves. So I challenge you to ask yourself that question, but also to ask your team this question, like, hey, are you trying to become something that you're not? And let's talk about that, because that can play a role in how we express ourselves on stage. So at the beginning, I said, we're going to talk about, should we be jumping up and down? Should we be running around? Should we be dancing? Okay, well, here's the honest truth. I would never sit here and tell you that it's right, wrong, or otherwise to do that, okay? Because that is completely between you and the Lord, between, the context of your church, what is relevant and appropriate, and all of that. So you have to answer that question. But, I was just in a Facebook group, and there were some people asking those questions, and I was actually surprised at some of the answers, because people were being pretty judgmental about this person who had asked, like, hey, I see people walking around a lot on stages, like you see it on Instagram and such, in larger churches or different worship settings where there's a lot of people on stage, there's a lot of leaders, and they're all just kind of pacing and walking. And there was a lot of criticism about that, and criticism towards this person. And it was kind of sad to watch that unfold, to be honest with you. But the reality of it is that we have to go before the Lord and ask like, hey, how do you want to use me? And Lord, fill me to the overflowing so that I can bless this community. And then we also have to ask the question of what's appropriate for this community, right? If you're in a more conservative church, that would be very off-put or very confused by that type of interaction, well, it's something that maybe they just need to grow into, right? And they need to be taught about it and exposed to it. And if that's something that you really want to see where there's demonstrative worship in your church, often that stems from, the fact that people just don't know the why behind the what, right? And so there's not that spark and that excitement and that desire to express themselves that way in worship because there's not an understanding of the why behind the what. But I will say that just because someone is not expressing themselves doesn't mean that they're not worshiping. So let's be careful not to be critical in those scenarios and just make sure that our hearts are right because we don't know. We don't know what's going on between that person and the Lord. And our job is to just make sure that we're doing everything we can to lead them to that place, right? And so that was a little bit of a side tangent, but I just want to make sure that we are mindful of our context, right? Mindful of the context and making sure that we consider that. And so I would never sit here and say like, well, you should be doing these things. You should be jumping up and down. You're not really leading worship if you're not doing X, Y, Z, because that's just not the case. You have to go and bring that before the Lord and then talk with your leadership and make decisions, together based on what is best, right? So we've talked about you are a host, right? That is number one. And that helps with stage fright. That does help with that stage apprehension or lack of confidence as you may feel. So we talked about that. Number two, we've talked about just kind of understanding that why behind the what, right? Not only for us, but also the congregation, but specifically that helps us to remember that we don't have to be somebody that we're not, right? That's what we've been talking about, is just making sure we understand like, hey, you don't have to conform into something that you're not. However, when we understand the why behind the what, and when we fully surrender ourselves to the Lord and to what He's doing, not only in our lives and our hearts, but in the hearts and lives of the people in our congregation, there is a natural overflow. There is a natural expression. Whether you are a super expressive, extroverted, bouncy person or not, there's going to be that overflow that shows. And so that's important for us to remember. And when you're talking with your team members, or if this is for you specifically, those two things are the biggest, with the third being that why behind the what. They are the biggest assets when it comes to gaining more confidence on stage and overcoming that stage fright or that stage apprehension, right? So those are the three things that I want you to keep in mind. And maybe you want to take these to your team. Maybe you've got some team members that are struggling. It's like, hey, number one, we are a host. Number two, you don't have to be someone that you're not. But number three, we got to understand the why behind the what. And there our natural overflow and expression comes, right? So those are the three things that I want you to think about and to keep in mind as you are working to grow as leaders and working to grow in the way that you lead your people, right? And the last thing that I want to say, and this has helped me a lot, is I view my opportunities on stage as an opportunity to teach. And that takes our mind off of the fact that we are on stage in front of hundreds of people, right? Because that a lot of times is the kicker. It's like, there's all these people up here. So it's not just one person watching me fail, it's multiple, right? So if we can view this through the lens of teaching, you are not only taking your mind off of like the lights and the mics and the, all the things, you are also putting the focus back on the people and saying like, hey, how can I help them understand the why behind the what? Is there an opportunity throughout this set, whether it's just a little segue between a song, that I can set them up to understand why we do this? Because if I'm up here raising my hands and closing my eyes and, nobody understands why, it's going to be less of a connection point for the people if they don't fully understand that. And so I always look for an opportunity to say like, hey, this song is from this scripture, and this scripture talks about, this aspect of worship, and this is why we do that. Or worship is gratitude in song, and this is how we express our gratitude to the Lord, and how, he then in turn comes and he refills us, or whatever the case may be. You fill in the blank for how you'd want to teach. But I look for opportunities to teach the congregations that I'm leading in worship, because we don't know who's there. We don't know who's out there. There may be seasoned Christians, but there may be people who just walked in the door for the very first time, and they're wondering like, okay, why am I singing "Thank You, Jesus, for the blood"? Like, why are we singing that, right? And so I try to view it through the lens of somebody who's brand new, and helping them understand like, no, this is not just a song. It's not just words on a page. It is actually the very life to our souls, right? And this is such a beautiful part of our walks with the Lord. And so looking for opportunities to teach our people is just such a gift to them, but also it takes your mind off of being on stage. So those are really the 4 things that I wanted to talk with you about today that will help you gain confidence on stage. And I know that we've talked about these things in the past, but how do we then communicate this to our teams, right? Because there's inevitably this conversation that we have to have where it's like, well, the singers are not engaging. They're not smiling. They're not, XYZ. And so that becomes a really tricky part of our job, because we have to come to our team and say like, hey, I need you to fabricate some sort of energy at 8:00 on Sunday morning, because it looks like you hate it here and that you would rather be anywhere else but up here. And so using these 4 techniques, using these 4 tips is going to also help you communicate these things to your team. But you got to go with them with a strong why, because if it's just like, well, we just smile, that's just what we do, and we don't do this, we don't do that, and we do this. Well, that's not going to compel them to anything, just like it wouldn't compel you to anything. So you got to sit down and be like, okay, what is the why behind this? Well, the why is so that we can engage with people and draw them in and point them to a place that we love to go, right? And so we want to really hit that home with people, that I'm not just telling you like, put on your dance line smile and make it look like you love to be here. Just pretend. And sometimes, honestly, we do have to do that, don't we? And that's a whole nother podcast where we're going to talk about how to worship through the war and worship through the pain. But for today, when you're communicating these things to your team, we have to talk about them. We have to, because eventually you're going to get comments from people saying like, yeah, like, the band members look like they hate it here. And so we do have to talk about them. So just simple little things that you can mention, that reminding them, hey, we're hosts, guys, and how can we host them well? We can show them that we love them. We can show them that we want them to be here. And we do that with our facial expressions. You don't have to fabricate it to be something that you're not, but we do need you to engage with your eyes, with your face, and a little bit with your body to make it look like you want to draw them in and you want to engage with them. So I bring those 4 things to you so that you can take them to heart for yourself, but also so that you can bring those 4 things to your team and hopefully come together and really be a blessing to your communities and also to one another, right? And My hope and prayer is that you walk away from this feeling empowered, feeling equipped, and feeling encouraged, because that is everything that we seek to do at Overflow Worship. We want you to feel like you can thrive with what you have where you are. So no matter how seasoned your team is, no matter how seasoned you are, you can thrive with what you have where you are because there's purpose in your placement. And I truly believe that. And sometimes I think that we forget it. We forget that there's purpose in our placement. And so I want you to remember that today. There's purpose where you are. And I know you can thrive with what you have where you are. You've got all that you need for today. God gives us everything that we need each day. So that is all for today. I hope that this was helpful for you to overcome some stage fright or just to boost your stage confidence and help your team do the same. Now, again, I invite you to please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review and write us a little note. Tell us what you like about the podcast. Tell us your favorite topics, and maybe even like a topic that you would like to hear. I would love that. So if you would take 2 minutes, it would really mean the world. I read every single one. They are such a blessing. And also remember to head over to overflowworship.com/join, overflowworship.com/join to get on our newsletter and get all the free stuff that we send your way every month. Until next time, guys, keep on thriving.